Okay, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Philip De La Calle, and I am one of the product engineers here at Pragmatic Works. Today, we're going to be talking about SSIS, or SQL Server Integration Systems. And this webinar is going to give you an overview on integration services, and we're also going to cover a range of topics. First up, we're going to be covering why one might use SSIS, so you can get a good look before you leap into this new technology. Next, we're going to be covering some common use cases for SSIS, so we'll be able to cover some scenarios in which you would elect to utilize this software tool. In addition to these common use cases, we'll also be covering who would use SSIS. This could be if you're new to, let's say, project management, if you're looking to choose a career path in data, or if you're simply looking to understand more about the industry. Following that, we're going to be exploring a small portion of Microsoft Visual Studio, which is the developer environment for SSIS. And today, we're just going to be getting our feet wet because the sheer scope of Visual Studio is it's enough to make some developers head for the hills. And finally, we're going to actually be going through and building a sample package together. So do not worry if you're new to development, if you are new to Visual Studio, or even if you don't know where the on button on your computer is. We're going to jump into SSIS together, and you'll come out on the other side having taken your first step into a much larger world. So, in the beginning, we didn't have very many tools for collecting and using data. We had things like Fire, Sticks, and the Wheel. And unfortunately, those early database administrators and developers couldn't really utilize those to interact with spreadsheets, databases, or cubes. We needed something else. So we tried cave paintings, which were definitely an improvement, don't get me wrong, but for the first time, we could actually back up our data. We could save our data. But if you wanted to share your data, or if you wanted to migrate it to a new cave wall, you basically had to go yourself and rewrite your data from memory or by hand, and the scalability of cave paintings is it's just terrible, almost as bad as using the OLEDB command. So we progressed a little bit. We started to get our calculations in line, ways to check our logic, to check our queries. We got a little closer. We could tell if things were yes or no, and then we got a bit closer. Unfortunately, computer gaming came out and productivity really started to get worse. And if your boss wasn't looking over your shoulder or you had a short attention span, we had a hard time getting data from one source to another. But then, young man in Seattle had a dream and it arrived. We had SSIS. Our data was saved, our minds were blown, and we were finally prepared to become the amazing DBAs and developers we always knew we were. We were prepared to take our data into the future and to empower all aspects of business, technology, marketing, and more with powerful analytical tools that could harness the raw power of information. So, prepare to hit the on button in your education as we move into the fundamentals of SSIS. So when you're developing integration service packages or SSIS packages, and don't worry, I'll tell you exactly what a package is in a moment, you're developing it for the purpose of creating an ETL process. And you're going to hear that term a lot in relation to SSIS. There will be times when you create packages that don't use all three parts of the ETL acronym, but for the most part, it's standard. And generally, ETL is what people are talking about when they're using and discussing SSIS. So what ETL stands for is, as you can see on the screen, extract, transform, load. So it means I'm going to extract data from some source. And as you can see from the visualization on screen, I can extract from one source or I can extract from multiple sources. Then you're going to transform the data. You may hear people say applying business rules to the data, two sides of the same coin. And finally, you go and load your data into your final destination. So a common scenario. As you can see on screen, there are multiple types of data sources. I might have an Oracle database, a SQL database, a DB2 database, all of them used for different parts of my business. And I'm going to use SSIS to extract the data out of those different data sources, transform them so that I can apply the business rules that are required for reporting purposes and then I'm going to load them into a centralized database, perhaps a data warehouse. So I'm going through this ETL step here. I'm extracting, I'm transforming, I'm loading to prepare the data for eventual reporting or for analytics, possibly in an analysis services queue. So that's what the whole idea is behind ETL. And again, you'll hear that term often in relation to data extraction tools like SSIS. Now, why would we use SSIS? Well, sprinkled throughout that last slide and my silly slides before then, there were a few hints dropped. Clearly, SSIS is going to be good for integrating multiple data sources. The last slide had a very similar look to this current slide. And once again, I encourage you to notice that we have a SQL Server source, we have a DB2 source, and an Oracle source. And we're pulling information from a flat file like a .csv. CSV stands for comma separate values, and a flat file meaning a file that is just text. So characters, white spaces, new lines, nothing else. We have all these different source systems which are available, and you really need to get information from all four of them. In this example, just one will not do. But if we can get all four of them together and pull them all together into a centralized database like a data warehouse, then we can have access to all of our data together. And that's really what SSIS allows us to do. It is great at integrating multiple data sources. It has built into it multiple data source types. So whether you need to go to SQL Server or Oracle, we can easily connect to that data and pull it into the appropriate location. SSIS is also data warehouse ready. You might be curious what that is. Well, this is an instructional class, and so I'm going to tell you. Data warehousing means that data warehouse ready means that SSIS has multiple tasks and components that are built into the tool that are designed so that you can build out and load a data warehouse. Things like the slowly changing dimension or SCD wizard are there so that you can load dimension tables for a data warehouse. You'll also find that SSIS has some capabilities for data cleansing, and that should be a little self-explanatory. We can use SSIS to cleanse our data as it comes in from the sources. So if we have incoming data that we expect to be incorrect or bad, I'm sure that many of you out there have experienced bad data coming from your data sources before. You can use SSIS to cleanse that data before you pull and insert it into your data warehouse or some other staging environment. So some examples of data cleansing tools within SSIS would be the data quality service transform. You also have derived columns, which we're going to be using later, lookups, and all of these transforms that are built inside of the data flow, which I do hope to touch on later, hopefully due to time. And those are going to help you cleanse your data as it comes through. So just to review, we have data source integration. It can integrate a variety of data sources at once. It's data warehouse ready. We have built-in tasks for loading a data warehouse, and we have data cleansing, built-in tasks for correcting bad data. Now, here we're going to look at some common use cases for SSIS, and I think this will be helpful for you, because it will give you an idea of when you would actually use SSIS, or maybe even scenarios at your job or in your classes. So here's our first scenario. I need to load a data warehouse dimension table without duplicating data each time I run it. So I need to run the same package multiple times, but I don't want the same data to be loaded each time that I run it. So the problem here is duplicate data. I want to make sure that I am not loading the duplicate data each time I run the package. The solution can be accomplished using SSIS, and it's something that I briefly mentioned last slide, and that's going to be the SCD, or slowly changing dimension transform, which is part of the SSIS data flow. The slowly changing dimension transform looks at new rows that are coming in from a source and checks to see if those rows have already been inserted into the destination. If they're already loaded, I can choose to send them off to another output if I so choose. So let's look at another scenario. In this one, I have to download and load files from an FTP server, a file transfer protocol server. Now, I do have FTP tasks natively built into SSIS, and I can use them to download and upload files to an FTP server and place them into a data flow, and then load them into a table. So we got one more scenario. And this one might be quite common for many of you out there because we're dealing with data quality. I have data quality problems when I load state data from customers. Here's a use case. Let's say perhaps one of your business analysts is doing a meeting for the board, and they need to pull all of your sales data for the entire state of Florida. Well, what if one person wrote FL for half the customers, and then another quarter of the customers had FLA, and then another quarter had Florida. So you have 100% of your Florida customers divided 3 ways. And if you improperly filter, let's say using Power BI, you're not going to get the full picture. So again, sometimes my data is FL, sometimes FLA, sometimes Florida, and I want to unify my data. I only want to show one version of that data, and SSIS can help me do that. So in this case, I'm going to use a DQS transform, a data quality transform, to help with data cleansing. As with any method of problem solving out there, I have many options to solve each of these problems. And as you become more familiar with SSIS, Visual Studio, the control and data flows, you'll discover many ways to solve each of these problems that I've already presented here today. Improper range checks, improper row counts, duplicates of data. We can solve all of those using SSIS. So what I'm actually going to do now is I'm just going to put up a quick little multiple choice question. You don't need to type it into the chat. Just think about the answer yourself, and let's see if you're correct. So remember, just think of this one in your head. It's just going to be, what does ETL stand for? I'll give you a few moments to figure it out, and then we will continue on with the webinar. So what does ETL stand for? Export, transport, load, extract, transport, land, export, transform, live, or extract, transform, load. So let's quickly put a little counter on the board. When that's finished, I will quickly let us all know what exactly the answer was. Remember, don't need to type it into chat, just think of it inside of your head. Oh, hang on, I've got music playing. There we go. Let's see. Should be coming out of my speaker. Well, the Jeopardy theme was supposed to play, everyone. You can all pretend that you heard it. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Here we go. And it was extract, transform, and load. Congratulations, we got that one correct. But again, ETL, very, very basic. So let's move on. We're going to look at the development environment for SSIS and do most of this through the control flow. We're going to look at the connection manager, precedence constraints, and common control flow tasks. Now, don't worry if this sounds like Elvish or Dothraki right now. I'm positive that by the end, you'll at least be able to answer a few questions right at data trivia night if you do that in your circles. So the development environment that you'll be using for SSIS development will be based off of Visual Studio. If you're a .NET developer, this will seem rather straightforward, but if you're not, don't worry. We're going to cover the different aspects of Microsoft Visual Studio together. We're going to look at looking at different ways of programming today because Visual Studio uses a GUI, a GUI, a graphical user interface. Now, depending on which version of SQL Server that you're using, the tool may have a different name. If you're using SQL Server 2008 or below, you'll be using a tool called Business Intelligence Development Studio, or BIDS. If you're developing in SQL Server 2012 or higher, you're going to be using SQL Server Data Tools. Now, don't worry, I know the names are different, but they're actually the same tool in Visual Studio, but they just gave it a new name in 2012, and they changed the name to synergize with some tools within Visual Studio. So don't be too concerned with the name difference. It's the same kind of environment. If you can use BIDS, you can use data tools. Now, another tool frequently used with SSIS is SQL Server Management Studio, or SSMS. If you have a DBA background, you'll know exactly what this is. But if you don't, SQL Server Management Studio is for running queries. It's for loading and repairing databases, and you can use it to administer SSIS projects and packages, scheduling them to run, maybe with stored procedures or SQL agent jobs, working with security. Things like that will be used inside of SSMS. All right. Now, for many of you watching, there may have been some words being thrown around that you didn't quite understand, but that is going to come to a close. We have some basic terminology to get you started with SSIS that I have here on the screen. And we're going to go through that now, and you'll see examples of them on the screen too. So first off, we have a package. A package is the basic unit of work in SSIS. Any development you're working on is part of a package. And a package, in turn, is part of a larger object called a project. But we'll get to that in a moment. So development in SSIS is done within a package. Now, we have items that are inside of packages. And the first part of the package that we're going to discuss is the connection manager. A connection manager is what defines the connection string to different sources and destinations that you'll be pulling and pushing data into. The nice thing about connection managers is that you can actually define them once at the project level, and then you don't have to redefine them over and over again as you create additional packages. You define it once, and then you can use it as often and wherever you'd like. Now, we're also going to be introducing ourselves to the concept of the control flow. And what that's going to do, the control flow, is actually a difficult thing to discuss and define without using the words control and flow. But basically, this is what controls the order of operations inside of your package. It tells which tasks to run and when and whether or not it can run in parallel or concurrently. You can actually have things running in parallel within SSIS depending on how the nature of your SSIS works, and it is multi-threaded in nature. So you have the option within your package to have things run simultaneously or sequentially, depending on your needs and the design of your data flow. Next up are tasks, and these are items within the control flow. A task is something that defines an operation inside of SSIS. An example of a task would be that you're trying to run a stored procedure to run an update on a table, so you can run an execute SQL task that runs an update for your table. Or if you want to move a file from one folder to another folder, there's a task that you could put inside your control flow that would accomplish this. Now, those are just some basic operations that you could use inside of a control flow, and you can have many tasks within your control flow too. However, while you can have many tasks per control flow, you can only have one control flow per package. So again, many tasks in a control flow, one control flow per package, many packages per project. The next item you can see are precedence constraints, and precedence constraints define the order of operations for your control flow, kind of like math class. The control flow shows the order of operations, and the order of operations are defined by the precedence constraints. This is where you can tell your control flow where and when to run, and if you can have tasks running in parallel. Next on our list of basic terminology, and I'm going to rush so that we can touch on it later in today's webinar, is the data flow. The data flow, while similarly named to the control flow, is actually a task within the control flow. And it's really important that we define the data flow because it's a special task that allows us to dictate data movement. Anytime you're dealing with a real ETL process, extract, transform, load, it's likely being done inside of a data flow task. So a data flow task is like another world within a package. And you'll see what I mean later on. Transforms are components inside of a data flow task. So you have components called data flow transformations. Essentially, they're tasks for a data flow. They are what allow you to apply business rules to your data as it's coming from your source and loading into your destination. So for example, I could be loading a CSV file, a comma separated value file. I dictate where I'm going to extract it from, its source, I could then use a transform to affect the data to change, alter, update the data, and then eventually send that data to a destination in my data flow to load it into the appropriate spot. The last item you'll see is the event handler. And these are often overlooked by developers. But what they do, and what makes them invaluable, is that they allow you to deal with errors. You can control what happens in the event of a warning or error or any sort of event you wish. Maybe you want to send yourself an alarm in the event of an error, and that is the point of the event handler. You can create a data log, send an email, you can create an event that happens should an error or something else occur. How is my package going to handle different aspects of an execution? Those sort of things are handled by event handlers. So let's do a bit of a deeper dive. We're now going to look into connection managers. So I mentioned that they were reusable, meaning that we can define them once and then use them over and over again within our packages. Starting in 2012, they created two different kinds of connections. The first being the project connection manager. And if you're using SQL Server 2012, you can actually utilize this concept of a project connection manager. They have the same concept in 2008 and earlier, but it was called a shared source, a data source. Basically, the project connection manager allows you to create a connection in the project that you've created and share it across all your packages, like I mentioned earlier. So since I mainly develop in SQL Server 2012 and beyond, that is why I mentioned that earlier when we can share our connections across our entire project. Now, naming conventions. Your connections will have standardized names when you create them, but it's considered a best practice to rename them using proper naming conventions. This way you can quickly and accurately identify connections across multiple packages. The connection that you see on the left side of the screen, local north wind, is actually an example of what not to do. SSIS defaults to naming conventions by server name followed by the database name. Now the problem with doing this, the problem with writing the server name and the database name is that often the server name will change. If you're using an enterprise environment and you have a development server, a QA server, and a production server, the name will change. You'll take a package that you're developing and transfer from one server to the next. And since the server name is part of the connection, it can get a little confusing since you're loading the data and running it off a different server. Remember, server name.database name is the default naming convention of Visual Studio. That is why I'm bringing this up. Our recommendation here at Pragmatic Works is something like what you see here, not the _1, but to do something slightly different than the default naming convention of server name.database name. I recommend you come up with some kind of a naming standard that does not include the server name. So one convention that we use at Pragmatic Works is we use provider name.type.database name. So for example, we have OLADB, since it's an OLADB connection. OLADB is the most common connection type you're going to come across, followed by the database name. So a good name would actually be oladb.sql.biexpress. So I probably should actually maybe change the one I have right over here. This way, we have our package being run across multiple servers. The name is uniform. There's no confusion with the server name we're using, and as we apply it to different packages, we can easily and accurately identify it. So that's an example on the screen. You can use underscores, which is called snake casing. You can use camel casing, which is all just capitalizing the first letter. You can use periods too, but just try to come up with a standard that is different than the default. Control flow. Now, the control flow is great because, like I mentioned earlier, it's a great way to develop with a GUI, a graphical user interface. And there's an example over on the right side of the screen, and it's a sample of an SSIS package. And you can see that the arrows are pointing to different parts of the control flow, breaking it down into smaller pieces for us to pick apart and understand. Now, a task is any of the boxes around them. These are all tasks, part of my control flow. These tasks will do different sorts of operations based on their type. Right over here, this one's going to grab a list of customers. And over here, we have, again, based on its name, and I have some other ones to the control flow that have script tasks, and it can be for .NET or VB. For the uninitiated, the world of programming, .NET and Visual Basic are popular programming languages. You can also have file system tasks to move files from one place to another. And then you can also use data flow tasks to do more of an ETL process. So these are our tasks, okay? Everything with a box inside of it. Now next we have precedence constraints. And these are the arrows that you see that are either red, green, or blue. You'll also see that they have some text on them that use some text on them to allow you to know under what circumstances your control flow will proceed to those tasks. Now bear in mind though, the descriptions are not on by default, but I'll explain how to turn them on as we move through the lesson. But again, the precedence constraints are going to help us define the order of operations for our control flow and how it's going to run. Green, red, blue. Success, failure, or simply completion. The final component within the control flow, let's let's quickly go through this. So we can see over here, I have step 1 and get customer list. And then when I get the customer list, when it completes, regardless of how it completes, it goes on to this step. And then step 1 has to succeed to go to step 2, which has to succeed to go to step 3. And then it goes through. If there's any errors, it logs them. But other than that, it completes them and sends out this email, or it goes through these 3 data flow tasks. The final component, you'll notice there's actually a box within a box. That's called a container. Containers are used to organize elements within a package. And there are several kinds of containers that you can choose from. You might actually, if you have any programming experience outside of SSIS, you might recognize for loops or for each loops. Well, you can actually create those simply inside of this tool. A for loop and a for each loop will loop or iterate over control flow tasks a certain number of times. Other ones are simply organizational ones like sequence containers that just make sure that things are kicked off in a sequence. Alrighty, so your first control flow. I hope you're all ready. We are now going to launch our first demonstration environment and how to use some of the common tasks within the control flow. So let me quickly open up Visual Studio. There we go. Nothing too scary. Essentially, what I've done, I'm actually going to walk us through what I've created here. But I've created 2 packages. The first one's called Module 2 Lab A. The second one's going to be called Module 3 Lab A. In the first example, I went through and I created a new SSIS project and a package. And then to create a package that I want to execute a SQL script. And then I want to then load the data into a new table. So what we're going to do here is the first step to create a new item. I just went to new, I went to project, and I typed in, I went to business intelligence, and I went to SQL Server Integration Services project. I then gave it a name, a location, a solution, and a solution name. That's essentially what I did here. So I typed in my example, you can see over here, SSIS class labs is the project name. It's not located here. It's actually inside of another folder on my computer. I put inside just a folder called SSIS class. And then as you can see over here for the solution, I called it SSIS class labs over here again. So that's how you create a new project. Now, when you create a new package by default, you'll see down over here, it just says package or package 1. You can right click them and you can rename them. In my instance, I renamed each of my packages what we can see over here. Once that's finished, I went through and I created some connection managers. So we can see my first one over here. What I connected to with this first connection manager was a database called AdventureWorks 2016. If you've gone through any sort of the walkthroughs from Microsoft, the AdventureWorks repositories are all educational repositories that Microsoft uses. We also use them at Pragmatic Works with our on-demand training. And then we have additional educational repositories. One's called Higher Ed. It simulates a fictitious university. But in my example, I chose my server. And this is, oh, never do what I just did. Never click the drop down, write out your server name. Otherwise, it's going to load them all. There we go. So I typed out localhost. Since it's my own machine, my own localhost, I can use Windows authentication instead of SQL Server authentication. And then I went through and I grabbed my appropriate repository. I can then test my connection, and I see it works. That means I'm properly connected to this database. I can now interact with those items. So that's our first one. So now what I did was I dragged an execute SQL task from the SSIS toolbox, this guy right over here, where all of our tools reside, and I dragged it and I dropped it right here. Now, when you initially bring an item over, you'll see the default name is just what it's called. But I renamed mine SQL setup table. What type of object it is? It's a SQL object, and it's going to set up my table. So let's actually open this up and see what I did. So I wrote a description, again, of what it does. That's a best practice. It's going to drop and recreate the zip code lookup table. Now I went to and I set up my connection type. I'm using OLADB, and I'm using, you'll see a list here, my AdventureWorks 2016 database. And grab that from my connection manager. I'm using a file connection, and I have a SQL file called module2 lab1a SQL. Now, I could hit new connection to establish that, but in this instance, I already have one set up down here at the bottom, and I'll open that up in a moment just so you can see what that looks like. It's an existing file. I navigated to where it is, and I hit OK, and that's why that file name showed up under my file connection. The next thing I did was I dragged over a bulk insert task, and I dropped it off over here, and I called it load zip data. So that's exactly what it does. Under the connection, I went through and I grabbed the item. I'm using my AdventureWorks 2016, and this is the destination, the table that I want it to go into. Now below that, we have the format, the delimiter, and the column delimiter. I'm using a comma separated value file, a .csv, okay? Basically what that means is, there are, in my instance, it knows it's at a new column when it hits a comma. That's how it can take a flat file that's made up of just text and lines and spaces and know how to separate them into different columns. So that's how I went through and I did that there. Okay, and once that was finished, I hit OK. And so now what I have in my example is I have a control flow that is going to go through and it's going to execute a SQL script, and then it's going to load zip code extract.csv into that table zip code lookup. And so one of the things that I can do now is that I can actually go through and I can execute this. All right. And when this finishes running, it's going to go into something called we can actually go into the progress, and we can actually see that it's happened. It'll tell us every single part that has been kicked off. If there were any errors or warnings, this is where they would show up. This is where we would go through and we would try to figure out what went wrong with our package. And if I actually wanted to go through and see those items appropriately, I could go back into SQL Server Management Studio and I could confirm for myself that it went through and it appropriately kicked off these items. But what I'd like to do now is I'd like to actually move on so that we can actually get to some data flow tasks. So let's swing this bad boy back up. Let's go to our next quick question. All right, again, think of this one in your head. Don't type it into chat. But when working in the Visual Studio environment, project files are contained inside of the configuration file, the package, the solution file, or the SSIS container. Here we go, we're going to count down. Where are project files inside of? Well, a package is part of a project. A project is part of what? You got about 13 seconds left. Think of that answer in your head. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1, and it was a solution. So we have from biggest to smallest, the solution holds projects. The projects hold packages. Packages hold things like control flows, and a control flow can hold your data flow inside of it. So it's like one of those Russian dolls. We can fit more and more and more inside of each one. So we have now become one with the matrix. We've handled the control flow. Let's now go jump into the data flow itself. We are going to utilize things like sources to extract information from them. SQL Server databases, flat file, Excel files. We're then going to transform our data. We're going to convert it. We're going to aggregate it. And then we're going to throw it into new destinations, a new SQL Server database table, or a new flat file, or a new Excel file. We can do all of that. So what we're going to do now is we can do it. We're going to jump into the data flow. Project number 3. And the first thing you might notice is that we're inside of the control flow, but there's a component here, data flow task. I dragged it over here. I renamed it. And when I double click on it, we are now inside of the data flow. Holy moly, it's a brand new world. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking data from a flat file. We're going to be applying some transforms to that information, and then we're going to finally load it into the database at the end. So what we're doing here is we went through, we created a new data flow task. We can see right here called load marketing leads. You can rename any component by simply right-clicking it and clicking rename. So the first thing we needed to do was we wanted to set up our source data. And I went to new the first time. And when I went to new, I then browsed and I found the appropriate file. So I'll quickly show what I did right over here. When I click new, I changed the name on top. I found the exact file. I said the text qualifier and the header row delimiter, so comma. And then you can actually go through and see the columns. We can even preview the data itself right over here. So this is the actual data inside of my CSV file, put into a nice table for me to look at. So the next thing that we're doing is we're taking the data from this flat file source, and then I'm putting it into a transformation called a derived column. A derived column is going to allow me to transform my data. I'm going to use an expression to create new column values. And what this one's doing is I'm actually going through and I'm replacing zip code, and I'm giving it a new column name called zip code. In this particular example, what I'm doing is I am ensuring that all of my zip codes are 5 digits, okay? I want to make sure that the zip code is only 5 digits before writing it to the table, okay? So that's what this derived column did. It's checking the zip code is between 1 and 5 characters long. It should be 5 characters long. That's what I'm standardizing them all to in this particular part. The next thing I'm doing is I'm doing a conditional split. What's a conditional split, you might ask? Well, it's going to allow me to take my good data and my bad data. In this particular example that I'm building right now, what I want to ensure is that my zip codes are 5 digits long, and I want to make sure that I have city and state data. I have a list of marketing leads. If I don't have city and state and a good zip code, how am I going to get my marketing materials to the appropriate customers? So if a item has city and state, it's going to go down one side, and if it does not, it's going to go down the other side. So let's actually open up this conditional split. Bad data is going to be an empty item for city or an empty item for state. Good data is going to be if it has both. So that's what's going to happen there. So what I did was I then did a lookup and I did a merge. And it gave me 2 different options with these outputs. I dragged the good data down over here, and I grabbed the bad output over here to do a lookup. Okay? So what a lookup's going to do is a lookup's going to go through, and I actually have a table already inside of my database. And if you download AdventureWorks, you'll have it too, called zip code lookup. And it's basically going to compare, I'll show you in the columns, city, and it's going to replace it if they find a good value for it. So if there's no city, it's going to look it up, and it's based on the zip code, and it's going to give us a brand new one. And it's also going to look up state abbreviation, and it's going to, if it's empty, it's going to replace the state with that new item. Okay. Now, if it gets a match, it's going to throw it out into this side. So the data is being merged back together once it's matched up. And if it does not, it's going to error out. Okay, I actually have a database specifically for errors. See, I've got a table called mailing error queue. So you can create your own tables to house bad information. So that way you can go through and review them and see, hey, what do we need to clean up? But this way you're not losing everything with the ETL process. It's running once, but you're getting the good, and instead of failing everything, we can send the bad information down a different pipeline to be cleansed. And finally, at the end, I'm inserting it into the repository again after it's been cleaned. So I extracted it from this flat file. I transformed it by making sure my zip codes are 5 digits long, by making sure that my city and state values were there. If they were, it went down here and waited. If it was not, we did a lookup to see, based on city and state, if we could find the appropriate information. And then we merged it back together and we sent the bad items to this error output. And at the end, we loaded it all back together. So what I can do now is I can actually execute this task. And there we go. It loaded 1,400 rows. Only 4 were bad. Of those 4, 2 were sent over here. 2 were sent to the bad items. Something else that you can do inside of your control flow for just a little bit of extra QA is that we can actually go through and we can attach these things called data viewers. Data viewers will allow us to actually see, let me throw it on here, the data as it's being loaded to different parts of our ETL. So let's execute the same task one more time. Now it's going to hit this first data viewer and it's going to stop. It's holding, it's waiting for me. So I'm looking through this and I'm saying, okay, let's see, I've got all this dummy data. Okay, cool. I've got a city, uh-oh, there's no state, and uh-oh, there's no zip code. So I guess what? These two, probably gonna work out okay. These last ones, I'm not so sure. Let's see what happens when we hit the next data viewer. So this one is for the match. He was able to match the zip codes and the city and give it a state of Florida. For the error outputs though, didn't have city or state, couldn't help us out. And it even gives us a description at the end. Let's see. This component does not supply error. Oh, there you go. Well, we actually have a tool at Pragmatic Works called the address verification transform, where you can actually bounce addresses against the United States Postal Service's own database, and we'll actually tell you why something failed out. That's part of Task Factory. That basically kind of fills in the blanks where SSIS might fall short. But yeah, data viewers are another great way to do QA to see why things are not working. And of course, we always have the ability to open up the progress and we can see how items are working out. Let's see over here. I have some warnings. Cannot open global shared. Okay, that's not a big problem for me. I'm the only guy running this. Warning, output state on output and component data cleanse is not subsequently used in data flow task. Removing this unused output column can increase data flow task performance. So there's some nice helpful ways that I can go through and I can actually tweak my information just to make sure it runs a little bit more efficiently. But that's about it that I prepared for today. We've gone through and we've made a control flow. We worked our way through a data flow task. And we got a little bit of the basic terminology. So at this point, what I would love to do with about 10 minutes left is I would love to go through and maybe do some light QA. If you have any question about anything you've seen, if you have any questions about ways to get into SSIS development, maybe you're looking for what's a great way to kind of dive in, or any resource I might recommend, feel free to throw them out. And if you have any questions about any other Pragmatic Works products as well, feel free to ask me that. I'm pretty well stacked on what we supply here. So yeah, the floor is yours, everyone.
Hey, Philip, here's the first question. How do we unit test for SSIS packages?
How do we unit test for SSIS packages? Okay, that's not exactly basic. There's a number of ways to do it. Obviously, you can compare row by row items and how they work. What I'm going to say right off the bat is there's actually a tool that Pragmatic has created called called Legitest. It essentially will allow you to create test-driven development environments similar to what a software developer or a web developer would utilize. That can do unit testing, it can do range checking, it can do duplicate testing, and the great thing about Legitest is that it's all completely automatable, because just like .NET development has test initialization, test execution, test assertion, and test teardowns, you can utilize Legitest to have packages or stored procedures or REST calls be the catalyst that kicks off a test. There's a 14-day trial that you can download. Just go to legitest.com. It is a really well-developed tool. There's both a desktop tool for Legitest that has a real developer feel to it, and there's also a companion server piece that has more of a business user view to it. And we're actually currently beta testing Legitest online as well. But yeah, if you're curious about that, I would definitely check out legitest.com. You can also, there's some walkthrough videos on there, and then of course on YouTube, we have numerous videos on how that works. I'm actually going to be filming a video this week on testing your customer list versus an exclusion list using Legitest so that you can ensure that you don't have any matches. And that's going to be important if you have any European customers, because the GDPR hits on May 25th. And even if you're a non-EU company, if any of your clients are in Europe at all, you're going to want to make sure you're compliant with that. And I know actually Facebook's been under, been under a bit of hot water, and they've been actually talking about making themselves more GDPR compliant. So yeah, great question. Maybe a bit more advanced in the intro class, but yeah, I would definitely check out legitest.com for that.
Okay, this is about 25 minutes into your presentation, and it says, will step 3 only execute when preceding tasks are either successful or completed?
Well, step 3, that was probably back to this one right over here. Will step 3 only execute when this first part gets completed or when this part succeeds? So based on the precedence constraint, yeah, we got this needs to complete. I do, however, actually have this data flow task. If you've ever done a demonstration with me, it's part of my BI Express demo, and step 3 in that demo actually does fail, but technically failure is still completion. It finishes in failure, so it does actually kick off these 3 data flow tasks. It does kick off this container, and it does also log the failure status. So hopefully that answers that question.
What is a dimension table in a data warehouse?
What is a dimension table in a data warehouse? Oh my goodness, maybe we should have covered some slightly more advanced topics, huh? Well, so a dimension table inside of a data warehouse, that's going to be it's going to be a set of, gosh, what's the best way to say this? So a dimension table, I'm trying to see if I can use some of the terminology that we already covered today. Well, we didn't talk about star schemas. Okay, so a dimension table is going to store attributes or dimensions for objects in a fact table. So for instance, if you are if you're data warehousing and you're using, like I say, an SCD wizard to update a student's information, you might want to throw into their information about first name, last name, birthday, gender, etc. So we would be basically organizing descriptive attributes as columns in your dimension table, and then we would be storing them as facts inside of a fact table. I hope that answers that question. It's probably a bit more in depth than we would get in this particular example. in this particular demo. If you are interested in learning more, here we go. There is a book called The Data Warehouse Toolkit. It's by a man named Ralph Kimball. And if you know much about data warehousing, the Kimball methodology is definitely one way of doing that. So the full title is The Data Warehouse Toolkit, The Complete Guide to Dimensional Modeling. It's by Ralph Kimball. As you're becoming a data developer, as you're becoming a DBA, Kimball will definitely be a name that you become very well acquainted with.
Okay. Someone wants to know how you check a native SSIS log.
How do you check a native SSIS log? Well, so we've got a couple of options to go through there and to do some logging. One of the things we can do is when you open a Visual Studio. Alrighty. So we go into a package, we go into menus, we go to SSIS, and you have the ability to look at logging right over here. And what we can do is we can go inside of here. Where are you? We can click on add over here, and that's going to add in some logging information inside of here. If you need the rows processed, we can also see that as well. So, you know, basically what we do is we would click on add to add a log in there, and we would basically, you know, say on what sort of events we want all that information to be logged, for instance. But you can essentially create those yourself. Some great resources that I recommend, let me quickly, obviously, Microsoft has a great amount of help on there, but something that I relied on a lot when I was younger was Stack Overflow. It's a fantastic resource. It's basically just a gigantic message board for developers of every single walk of line. I mean, on the front page, we can see questions on Postman, on C++, Arrow running a batch file. I mean, if you look through here, it's going to cover almost every, Postgres. Okay, that's another SQL language over there. PowerShell, C. I mean, if you need to look up Ruby or REST API using PHP. I mean, this is a developer's, paradise. If you're just getting started out there, something that a professor or even I will tell you is that when you first begin your career, you are something called a Google developer, and you utilize the tool to, answer a plethora of questions, and Stack Overflow is going to be a great resource, but so is Microsoft's own message boards too.
Okay. Where can we find information on the difference in administration for package versus product deployment?
Finding information on deployment, I mean, I would say definitely Stack Overflow would probably be a good place to look. If you're really interested in doing product deployment, you want a deeper dive, you could do a free trial on pragmaticworks.com. We have something called on-demand training. There's a whole multitude of different topics that we can take a look at. Oh, here it is, right over here on the bottom. I had it there. Let's see. On-demand training. It looks like this. Let me pull it up for you guys to take a look at. A free trial over here. Woohoo! And basically, we have a number of different packs that you can go through. Where is it the data sheet I want to look at? No. There is we recently changed our website, but there used to be a way where if you were to type in like the kind of classes you want to take, like you could type in like, oh, I want to be a BA developer, and it will.
It's on the training main page.
Ah, there we go. Cool. But basically what you do is, oh, there's the old UI. So basically you go through here like, oh, I want to be a business analyst. And it's like, oh, then I recommend these classes. Or I want to be a BI developer. And so, an architect as well. Just kind of some good classes that you might want to go through and utilize. But yeah, and then you can also filter by subjects as well. These are our instructors down here in the bottom. Hey, Mitchell. But yeah, that would be a great way to go through here. The resource library is another great thing to go through if you want to learn more about deployment. But again, Google is your friend, Stack Overflow is your friend, Microsoft's help pages are your friends. There's definitely lots of resources out there to learn how to do proper project deployment modeling.
Okay. think we have time for one more question. Does every package require a configuration file to be created to store SQL logging? Can one be used for multiple packages?
For multiple packages. I generally have done it that way. If there's another way to do it, I would say that the person I would ask immediately would be to go ask our CEO, Brian Knight, considering he didn't write the book on SQL, but he's wrote a number of the books on SQL. If that's something that you're interested in, send that question over to Liz, or send it to my email, which is on the screen right now. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, again, I recommend just reaching out to me. And if there's any questions that you have that I don't have the answer to, we've got a lot of good resources here at Pragmatic Works that I can reach out to and come up with some good best practice questions, or just some good ways on how to get started in the industry.
All right, great. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. I'll make sure and get these questions over to Philip because I think we might have missed a couple, and just in case he can follow up a little bit more on some of these. As always, this session was recorded, so it will be available to you tomorrow via email. You'll receive that. If you have any questions that you didn't get a chance to put in the window, please email us, either Philip or you can email me, Liz. It's the email that comes with all your GoToWebinar information, and I'll be happy to pass those along. We appreciate everybody for joining us. Thank you, Philip, for hosting, and we'll see you guys on the next one.